evening and welcome to Primetime Lawmakers, GPB's nightly coverage of the Georgia General Assembly for Wednesday, February 1st, 2012, the 12th legislative day of the 2012 session. I'm Scott Slade. Coming up at tonight's program, serious consequences could be coming for bullies in Georgia's public schools. A bill has heard a committee that would ban those convicted of bullying or hazing from attending public schools or college. And moving to the budget front. Today, the subcommittees of House Appropriations move and approve their parts of the FY 2012 budget. The full Appropriations Committee is expected to vote on that budget tomorrow. It's Education Week on Lawmakers, part of GPB's ongoing effort to improve the graduation rate in the state. Tonight's topic, education funding. I'll be joined in studio by Herb Garrett, Executive Director of the Georgia School Superintendents Association. See where the money comes from and how it's being spent. And for some in-depth analysis of today's Capitol News, especially focusing on education, I'll be joined by Maureen Downey, education reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. All that and more is coming up tonight on Primetime Lawmakers. But first, we go to the Capitol, where Primetime Lawmakers Sandra Parrish is standing by this evening. Some action today on strengthening Georgia's anti-hazing laws. Sandra, what happened?
That's right, Scott. A subcommittee of the House Education Committee heard testimony on the need to make Georgia's current law that was passed in 1986 by then Senator Pierre Howard tougher. Representative Joe Wilkinson, sponsor of this current bill, told committee members it was Howard himself who helped write it.
I had hoped back in 1986 when we had passed this legislation that would curtail some of the activities, but obviously with the sad headlines that we've been reading about and seeing, it has not happened.
Former House member Terry Lawler among those testifying at today's subcommittee hearing. He wrote the current law 25 years ago that makes it a misdemeanor of high and aggravated nature to commit hazing. Now Representative Joe Wilkinson wants to expand it to ban anyone convicted of the crime from attending any secondary or post-secondary public school in Georgia.
We started hearing about hazing in sports teams and interestingly, minor sports and women's sports. And that's when we decided, perhaps this is the time to come forward with really tough legislation, to add on to the excellent legislation that was passed 25 years ago, but to make it even tougher.
There is no such thing as mild forms of hazing. Hazing is hazing, and we have to be clear, we've got to stop these practices, period.
Joseph Gilman with hazingprevention.org says hazing actually starts much younger than college.
Hazing has actually been reported as early as junior high school. This is a problem that starts early in life and it actually moves through, and the more that they're hazed in middle school, high school, they then realize when they get to college, well, this is just part of what you have to do to join an organization, and we think that's wrong.
In fact, representatives of fraternities and sororities testified they're doing all they can to curb hazing in college.
Not only do you have to go through the recruitment process to be asked to join, but then you further have to prove yourself for full membership in the organization. And that's when it crosses the line, I believe, from perhaps individually bullying a person to you have to prove to us even further that you are worthy of this membership. And that's when you move into the hazing component.
Representative Wilkinson tells me he realizes his bill will likely be changed during the committee process. He says he would not be opposed to a two strikes you're out policy. The Senate Judiciary met late into the day on a couple of bills dealing with child abuse. Senator Renee Unterman tells me her bill would require anyone who knows of child abuse to report it. Currently, only 7 professions, such as doctors and teachers, must do so or they're subject to a misdemeanor. Unterman says it's a good time to expand the law in light of the charges against Penn State assistant football coach Jerry Sandusky.
This is not like if you're in Walmart and you see a mother spanking a child. Child abuse is defined very specifically in the Georgia Code, and it has to be pretty intrusive that you're committing a crime. And it would be like if you knew a next door neighbor and you knew that that neighbor was locking a child up in a closet and you didn't do anything about it. You didn't call DFACS, you didn't call the police. This is what this is about.
The committee delayed action on that bill, saying they need more time to study it, as well as a companion bill by Senator Charlie Bethel that would extend the statute of limitations for a victim to report abuse until they turn 28, or in the case of rape, age 33. Reporting live, I'm Sandra Parrish for Primetime Lawmakers.
All right, Sandra, thank you very much. The State House is giving unanimous passage today to a bill to allow students to have their smartphones or other electronic devices in class for learning.
Right now, it is against the law in the classroom. I didn't bring my cell phone. Yeah, I did. If you were to use your smartphone, if the teacher had a lesson and said, hey, go to this website and y'all look at it and we're going to have a lesson, that's against the law in the state of Georgia today. A law passed in the era of beepers, when people were worried about beepers in our classrooms, makes it illegal. In my county, Forsyth County, we have Bring Your Own Technology Day. They do bring these things. We have a waiver because we're IU squared. But we want to go ahead and get that out of the code and say, you know what, we're going to let the local principal and the local superintendent make policy as far as how they want to kids use the technology in the classroom. Clearly, we're not saying we want them to talk on their phones in the classroom, but it is becoming more and more practice to bring an iPad, to bring your iPhone, to bring your Droid in, and to participate in the lesson.
And now we go back to the Capitol where Keosha Howard is standing by live. She reports a movement in the budget process. Keosha, what happened today?
Good evening, Scott. The legislature comes one step closer today to finalizing the fiscal year 2012 budget. Today, the House Appropriations subcommittees passed their versions of Governor Nathan Deal's 2012 amended budget. The Education Subcommittee left in the governor's proposal to give $9 million to charter schools affected by the state Supreme Court ruling declaring them unconstitutional. Vice Chair Tom Dixon explains.
The governor proposed a payment to work with the charter schools that were affected by the Supreme Court decision. And the committee actually left that money intact. There are a number of charter systems in the state, and they receive a little additional funding as a part of their status as a charter system. And so just the same as there's a midterm adjustment for the regular QBE funding, that gets adjusted too based on increased enrollment in those systems. And then there were 6 more systems that had switched to charter system status, and so we had to add the funding for those.
Vice Chair Earl Earhart says that the Higher Education Subcommittee made a small change that helps North Georgia College. He also reveals priorities for the fiscal year 2013 budget.
One small change in the FY12 budget for North Georgia College. It's just a rebalancing. They were about $45,000 short on the grant portion of for the Cadet Corps, and they wanted to take that from the scholarship in 13 and just rebalance. It's no new money, nothing else. Otherwise, we stayed with the 2% cuts that were recommended by the governor. There's a recommendation for a $3.9 million cut in the technical college system, and to do that, it anticipates closing about 20 institutions with FTEs under 200 students. What I want to do is I'm going to take the governor's recommendation, and our committee took the governor's recommendation for the 12 supplemental, but what we want to do in the 2013 is look at the specifics of the individual institutions, whether or not they're actually going to close, and what the formula was used to create that.
The full House Appropriations Committee is expected to vote on subcommittee recommendations tomorrow and begin looking at FY13 numbers over the next few weeks. In other news, a victory today for the Higher Education Facilities Authority. The Senate passed a bill to give them more bonding power. Senator Cecil Staton says this will allow state colleges, universities, and technical schools to start new projects.
The bill will increase the maximum authorization from $300 million to $500 million. Now, some of you may be asking why the need to increase this. Well, they have, as I mentioned earlier, already issued more than $294 million in bonds. Fortunately, the initial $300 million has dealt with a backlog of projects that were sitting there and waiting when the legislation was moved into place. But there are other projects and will be other projects going into the future where this can be of great benefit. There is a very thorough vetting process that takes place before a project can be approved. There is a board for these projects, and the Board of Regents and the Chancellor have set very stringent guidelines to make sure that the funding is in place and the revenue will be there in order to pay for the bonds.
Senator Staton also points out that the bonds are funded by fees and services that are guaranteed, such as food services, room and board, and parking. Live from the Capitol, I'm Keosha Howard for Primetime Lawmakers.
Thanks for bringing us up to date this evening, Keosha. Set 'em up, Joe. The House Regulated Industries Committee gave a do-pass recommendation to legislation today allowing tasting rooms on distillery premises. Tasting rooms allow a half-ounce sample of distilled spirits to visitors. The bill charges that if a city approves a distillery, tasting rooms are automatically approved. Opponents to the bill wish to leave the decision to city and municipal governments to allow for more local control. That legislation moves on to House rules. After a few rounds of discussion, the committee also addressed a bill regarding the brewpub distribution system. Representative Richard Smith authored the bill recommending that the maximum number of barrels of beer the brewpubs can manufacture and sell on the premises changes from 5,000 to 10,000. The bill also removes the restriction that beer must be sold in draft form. That measure was sent to Legislative Council for further review. The committee also addressed a bill dealing with certification eligibility for engineers and land surveyors. As the law currently stands, if an applicant can pass the engineering or land surveying exam, he or she is qualified to build bridges, buildings, and other public structures. The proposed legislation would require all engineer and land surveyor applicants to first graduate from a 4-year accredited institution. The committee gave a due pass to that legislation. It moves on to House rules. School nursing programs will be getting a high-tech infusion under new legislation by the House Health and Human Services Committee today. Telemedicine could be making its way into public schools. The bill, sponsored by Senator Greg Goggins, would allow nurses to use video conferencing and other methods with off-site healthcare professionals to help treat student illnesses. According to Senator Goggins, telemedicine is becoming more and more popular across the state. The committee gave the legislation a due pass, and it moves to the House rules. It's Education Week here in Primetime Lawmakers, all part of GPB's effort to help improve the graduation rate. Every night this week, we're featuring a different education topic with expert guests to keep you informed on the important issues on education in Georgia. Tonight, we're very happy to welcome Herb Garrett of the Georgia School Superintendents Association to discuss education funding. It's great to have you in Primetime Lawmakers, Mr. Garrett.
Thanks for having me.
Boy, you know what? The education funding can be so technical, arcane, dry, even nerdy and geeky, but if we don't pay attention to it, it can bite us, can it?
I would agree.
Yeah. So how do you wade into that? How can you explain such a complicated, multi-pronged subject like that to make it simple for everybody?
Well, I think it's really not as complicated as a lot of people make it seem. Education funding comes from 3 sources. The state of Georgia furnishes state money to local school systems to educate children in public schools. The local taxpayers put in property tax money to add to that, and then the federal government gives us money that we use for Title I schools where there are high concentrations of youngsters who are poor, and for the school lunch program. So that's kind of a nutshell review of where it all comes from.
And a lot of the fights is over how that pie is divvied up from county to county, system to system, right?
There's not so much fighting between system to system. I think most of the fighting, in all honesty, is between local systems and the state. Most of the arguing and complaining and fussing really is between locals in the state about how much each should put into the formula.
We're going to touch on a lot of priorities tonight. First, let's take a moment to explain an acronym and references for our viewers. The Quality Basic Education, or QBE funding formula, is how the state calculates the education budget provided to public schools. That formula is based on QBE earnings, the cost of direct and indirect classroom instruction, which is supplemented by the 5 mil share that local systems are expected to contribute. We'll talk more about that in a moment. Categorical grants, which are funds for transportation, sparsity, and low incidence special education students. And finally, equalization, which is additional state monies for counties that are at an economic disadvantage. Another term we're sure to reference, and that you'll hear in any discussion about education budgets, is austerity. These are across-the-board cuts that have been implemented since 2003. Well, let's start with the last point and move back. Austerity has sort of become the law of the land, isn't it? We're getting along with less money than we've had in a long time.
We'd never heard that term before 2003, but it's been a part of our existence ever since. The austerity cuts now over the last couple of years have been so heavy from the state that in reality the state is only furnishing about 82% of the funds that should go to local school systems, and local property taxpayers, where they can, are having to make up the difference. Mm-hmm. That's the major reason that so many local systems these days are going fewer than 180 days for students and fewer than 190 for teachers.
Back it up for me. Explain it maybe in year terms. We're spending money in education like it's what year?
Probably about 2007, maybe 2006. The amount of state money that's going to local school systems is probably pretty similar to those years. Mm-hmm. The difference being that we have 125,000 more students than we had then.
So you're carving the pie in 125,000 smaller pieces on top of everything else that's already there.
That's correct.
And making up that money winds up being a local issue.
And some counties and cities can do that more readily than others. There are systems across our state where the property tax, the wealth of the property tax digest is so small that they just can't make up the difference. It really exacerbates the difference between the haves and the have-nots.
QBE funding, quality basic education, is that one of the classic unfunded federal mandates that state and local school systems have had to make up?
Well, QBE is a state mechanism. It's not a federal mechanism, and it's the state funding formula that was devised in 1985. The formula itself is not a bad formula. You do a student count, and you give systems money based on not only the number of students they have, but you recognize the fact that there are some students that are far more expensive to educate. Children, for example, who are severely handicapped could only be in a classroom that have 4 or 5 students, and that's a lot more expensive than, say, a high school English class with 30 students. So the QBE formula recognizes other expenses, the electric bill, the bill that it takes to pay the insurance. It recognizes all of those things, but in all honesty, it's outdated, and there are pieces of it that have been ignored for several years.
Is there any action in the background that might update that to make it a little more, to bring it up to speed for this year, for 2012?
Well, not for 2012 or 2013. There's a commission at work now that was authorized a year ago by the General Assembly to study the education funding formula and make recommendations for change. One of the biggest changes that needs to be made, for example, is that if you study the QBE formula, you won't find any mention of technology anywhere. Well, in 1985, there wasn't much technology. There was a period of time when local school districts got money from the lottery to help with technology infrastructure.
It was part of where the original mandate for the lottery.
It really was, but none of that money has gone to local systems since 2003 either. That was sort of a watershed year.
Let's take a moment to take a look at the FY 2012 budget highlights, if we can do that, for K through 12 education. The total K through 12 budget is $6.96 billion, which reflects the loss of $141 million in American Recovery Act funding. Those federal dollars expired in 2011. It also reflects a $1.1 billion cut into QBE funding, that paucity of money that we've been talking about here the last few minutes. I would think maybe one of the easiest numbers to understand is average per pupil expenditure, how much we're spending on each school child in Georgia. How about dealing with those numbers for us to give us a feel for what we're doing there?
The statewide number, based on the most recent data we have, which is the end of the 2010-11 school year, was almost $9,000 a year, almost exactly $9,000 a year. So that's a pretty good measure of a statewide expenditure. But Scott, it varies widely from system to system. There are systems, for example, near where both of us live, say Henry County, where the expenditure is closer to $6,500, and that's economy of scale and the fact that there are, because it's such a high growth system, that there are a lot of young teachers there, so the salaries are a little bit lower. But you go to Decatur City, where the expenditure is probably closer to $12,000, and what that represents is a system that has made a strong commitment to very small class sizes. And if you're going to have small schools and small class sizes, that means a lot more salaries to pay. So it varies widely from system to system across the state.
So this is wind up being a local issue to make up the difference. Let's say a county or a city says, hey, we want the best schools in the states, or we want better schools, and we're going to have to raise property taxes. What do you all think? Does that happen?
That certainly, Decatur's a great example of that. I've heard a leading citizen from Decatur say that we have great schools and the taxes to prove it. So there are cases where that is the case. There are other places in the state, though, where the property tax digest is so small in numbers that they can't do it. I've used a couple of examples. Jeff Davis County, for example, in Hazelhurst, almost 70% of their budget is state dollars because they don't have the local dollars to put into it. But if you go up on the north end of the state in Rabun County, only 24% of their budget is state dollars because they do add a whole lot of local money to it.
Rabun County, Mountain County, Northeast Georgia.
Yes.
A little bit of trivia you and I talked about earlier. The wealthiest county in Georgia for education?
Greene County. Lots of lake property that's very valuable, but not a very large enrollment. So on a wealth per child basis, it's the richest county in Georgia.
Do you see a move to wind up equalizing rural schools, especially with metro area schools, to bring them into obviously Greene County is not the metro area. Rabun County certainly isn't.
There is a piece of the QBE formula that is called equalization grants, and it is additional state money that is meant to bring those systems that are lower in wealth per child at least up to the state average. That is under revision now at the General Assembly, and it has become a very expensive program and hard to fund, but I think there's a commitment on the part of our General Assembly to continue to do that.
One more question. $9,000 a year per pupil average in Georgia. How much higher should that number be?
I don't know that it's so much the number. I think the number's probably about right. It's how those dollars are spent.
Okay.
And most of the places in Georgia, I think that boys and girls can get a great education for $9,000 a year.
Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for
asking.
asking
You did clear
me.
some of the mud. You really did. It's a complicated subject. We're going to take a short break on Primetime Lawmakers, but don't go anywhere. This is the place for in-depth analysis of Capitol News. When we come back, Maureen Downey will join us, education reporter for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Stay with us. This week is Education Week of Primetime Lawmakers, and tonight that theme continues. To our reporter roundtable, Maureen Downey is a longtime reporter with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. She's been writing about education for 13 years. Education funding, and you name it. Some of the most arcane technical things that you have to get into the weeds for to make sure our kids get a decent education. Any thoughts on what Herb Garrett had to say about how we pay for all this?
I think the most important point that Herb made is that education funding is complicated. Education funding is not a simple matter of $9,000 per pupil, because you have students who have high needs who may be $25,000, and you have pupils who may in fact require nothing extraordinary who may be $6,000. So I think it's very hard to talk about school funding. It's also hard because, as Herb explained, it's got three parts: local, state, and federal. Mm-hmm. And increasingly the local share is getting bigger and bigger. At the same time, the feds and states are putting more responsibilities, they're funding less.
And that's been a massive shift really over the past decade, isn't it? More focus on local funding, and how some communities are stepping up saying, okay, we're willing to pay for better schools.
Right. And the complicating thing about that is that the communities that step up have two things going for them. They have local will and local ability. You can have the will to want to pay more for schools and not simply have the money in your community. And he cites Decatur, where I happen to be from, and there you have the twofold. You have the the perfect union. You've got will and you've got ability, because you have sort of an affluent residential base, and rural Georgia does not have that.
Hot issues at the Gold Dome, particularly dealing with ineffective teachers. Where do you see that going? And we started the session with a couple of things about that.
Well, ineffective teachers, which of course is something teachers are not happy with that focus on, because they would rather look at ineffective funding. But ineffective teaching is really the centerpiece of our Race to the Top grant. Georgia was one of 11 places to win Race to the Top. We're getting $400 million, and with that we have to figure out a better way to identify ineffective teachers, to reward effective teachers, and to make all teachers better. And that really is a race right now going on at State DOE, because we have a very imposing federal deadline to put into place what we promised to do in our Race to Top application. So in fact, Georgia is now beginning this month to pilot, beginning last month, January, to pilot new ways of assessing teachers on just really how good they are.
And one of those things I noticed in a couple of notes you've made on this subject, and we've talked about this before in Primetime Lawmakers, changing the way teachers are evaluated. Going beyond what is often just a few minutes in a classroom by a supervisor a year to something a little more objective.
Right. Georgia, like every other state, almost all teachers get positive or effective evaluations. I think 98% of teachers nationwide are deemed effective. And that doesn't serve teachers well, and it doesn't serve students well. So what Race to the Top is trying to do is create a better system. And what they're rolling out now in the 26 Race to the Top districts are more intense observations in the classroom. They'll be also some look at how the students fare on tests. And of course that is the sticking point with teachers and with researchers, whether or not you can really judge a teacher by how well students perform on the test.
Yeah, well, what about this move to give kindergartners some of the same rights that a college student would have participating in the teacher evaluation? How would that work?
Well, when the Race to the Top team from DOE came into the AJC and told us about that, I wrote about it, and I actually put a picture up of the smiley faces. Kindergartners will be asked to evaluate their teachers with smiley faces, and sort of the sad face, happy face. and teachers were not happy about it. I said that the kindergartners might be smiling, but the teachers won't be. You know, I think DOE felt since they're piloting this, they'll put it out there for kindergartners to sort of rate their teachers. But frankly, I think that will disappear. I think that the teacher resentment of that was so deep, I just don't think it'll survive.
You're deep in the weeds in this issue. You know, what do you think is the most important thing that's going on right now inside the state halls of power dealing with education?
Well, I think what's probably the most important is what's not going on, which is, of course, the legislature itself is not looking at the most important thing, which, you know, I still would say is teacher quality. Okay. I think that they've abdicated that to some degree to race to the top, saying, you know, the race to the top folks will deal with that. I think the most important thing going on right now would be Jan Jones's resolution trying to get a constitutional amendment to allow funding of charter schools. And I think, again, in principle, we're all behind charter schools. Her amendment, though, I think challenges a long time way we funded schools. It actually allows, from my read of it, it allows the legislature to redirect locally raised taxes to charter schools that may or may not have the approval of the locally elected Board of Education. And that would put state hands on local money in a way that hasn't existed before.
Everything from textbook approval to the way they spend the money on buses.
Well, it would allow these charter schools to basically use money that the public, the local board, didn't want to approve the school. You know, Jan Jones would argue, and I'm sure if you have her here, she'll argue quite well, that it's all about school choice and giving parents what they want. Others would argue that the local community, the money in that community doesn't just belong to the parents. Every single person who pays taxes contributes to the schools. So the community has to be in agreement on what they want their schools to look like.
Finally, something you wrote about in the AJC today in your blog. Do you think we'll ever have a webcast for signing day for academics?
No. And, you know, as somebody said, when 72,000 people show up at the UGA library to watch somebody studying chemistry, we will have signing day. And I think it's really a shame. I mean, I was stunned to see that public schools in Georgia pull kids out of class to watch their classmates sign to play football. You know, I think that is a bit much. If I were a parent and in a school like that, I would have real concerns about my child missing, you know, algebra or missing, you know, AP English to watch a classmate sign that they're going to play at UGA or Tech. But, you know, again, I'm not a football fan and I'm not from Georgia, so as my posters will tell me, I don't understand football in the South.
Do you think that finally that the Hope Scholarship patch is going to stay where it is?
I think the Hope Scholarship is a mess. I think the changes have really made it more confusing. It used to be something that you could understand, you know, in a catchphrase, and now you need a spreadsheet and a calculator to know what you are going to get or not get. But I think actually, despite some interesting proposals out there, I think the governor may be right that it might be smarter to leave it alone, see how his changes last year, which were complicating factors.
Let it perk for a while.
Yeah,
we'll
play out.
Right there for now. Thanks so much for joining us, Maureen. It's great to have you. Tomorrow on Lawmakers, the FY 2012 supplemental budget is expected to be voted out of the House Appropriations Committee. We'll have complete coverage of that story. We continue our Education Week tomorrow looking at inequality in rural education. Representative Brooks Coleman and Representative Amy Carter, both from the House Education Committee, will join us. Viewers in Americas, Tifton, Swainsboro, any part of rural Georgia, don't miss that. It's all part of our ongoing commitment to improving the graduation rate across the state. You can see a rebroadcast of this program at 5:30 tomorrow morning. Coming up next at GPB, it's Georgia Traveler going deep sea fishing in Savannah, celebrating Buggy Days in Barnesville. We'll take in the Booth Western Art Museum in Cartersville and rollerblading through Atlanta. And that's Georgia Traveler right here on GPB. We'll see you tomorrow night at 7 o'clock right here.
This is a GPB original production.